Hello and welcome to the Shout Online Conference Series. My name is Jonathan and we're talking about water. And today we're talking about water quality. In fact, today and tomorrow we're talking about water quality because we have another 2-day Shout Online Conference in store for you. You're in exactly the right place and we're really glad you're with us. We do these sessions live because we value the interactivity that we can have with you, your questions and your comments, and sharing what's going on in your neighborhood, wherever that neighborhood is around the world. We have people joining us from across the United States, North America. We have people joining us from Asia and Europe. We often have people joining us from South America. I'm eager to see who is with us today. And to that end, we'd love for you to feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box on the left side of the screen. You can go ahead and just type into the small area at the bottom left corner. Tell us who you are. If you have a group gathered, tell us a little bit about them. We'd love to get to know you so that we can make sure we're tailoring our sessions today to what it is that you're looking to learn. I wanted to mention that the Shout Online Conference Series is brought to you, of course, by the Smithsonian, as well as by Microsoft Partners in Learning and Taking It Global. And we want to thank all of them for making this series possible. And actually, we have already our first person joining us from the Middle East today. Anna is joining us from Iraq. Welcome. Good to have you with us. So please do use that chat area to continue to share with us as you go along. You don't have to just enter questions. As you're doing now, you can enter comments and reflections as well. So here's a little look at how the day will go. In just a few moments, I'm going to introduce Amy Fowler, who's going to be talking about invasive species and how they affect water quality and perhaps what we can be thinking about when we think about invasive species wherever we live and how they might be affecting the water. We'll then turn our attention to the role of forests on water supply and quality, and we'll be joined by Jess Parker, who is right here at CERC, and he's going to be leading us on that overview and that tour. Then we'll go to the letter N, nitrogen, and we'll bring phosphorus in and people as well, and Don Weller is going to talk about the impacts of nitrogen and phosphorus and the role that people play with those two elements in our environment. And finally, we'll combine real and virtual watersheds and learn how we can teach stewardship, sustainability, and sound science. And that will be brought to us by Mark Haddon, whose very chair I am sitting in right now. So we know he's here because he is our host. So we're looking forward to that. By the way, where are we right now? Well, the live camera you're looking at is of a fish tank just outside the room we're in. We're looking through a glass window, and we are in the Reed Education Center at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center here in Edgewater, Maryland. In fact, in that tank is are these two guys, among others. They're looking at us right now. This was taken a few moments ago. They are our live studio audience, and you are our live international audience. Also just taken outside of our building where we are is a boat heading off to go investigate and do some research perhaps. There are school groups and visitors here at CERC. We hope perhaps one day you will be among them and come visit. A beautiful day here in Edgewater. You'll learn more about the facility and the research that goes on here throughout the day. And to start that off, we're going to go ahead and introduce Amy Fowler. There she is. Hi, Amy.
Hello.
Amy is of course joining us. She is usually based here at CERC, so we are at her home today. She's a postdoctoral fellow in the Marine Invasions Lab, studying invasive species that affect aquatic life and nearby ecosystems. So we're going to learn all about that today, and I know that Amy will enjoy your questions. So feel free to jump in and ask them as we go along. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the beginning of the visuals that accompany Amy's narrative today.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Jonathan. And hello to everyone out there in internet land. I actually saw someone come up from Knoxville, Tennessee. It's close to I grew up in just outside Memphis, Tennessee. So hello to the Tennesseans, I guess. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview about CERC since I'm the first presenter. Smithsonian has a lot of different environmental research centers, and this is one of them. We're located out in Edgewater, Maryland. I know that there's another Shout conference that was in Panama, and that's another one of our international research centers. So the CERC campus, you can see here. Where's the little... I'm looking for the clicker.
Oh, let's see. I'll go ahead and bring you forward, and we'll figure it out. Oh, you wanted the little arrow, yeah?
Yeah, the little arrow.
At the top part of the screen there, next to the word draw. Just below. I'm not seeing it on your screen
Oh,
either.
here.
There you
It's at
go.
the bottom. Sorry.
Okay, no worries.
So here we are. The Reed Education Center is about right here. And down here we have a really nice dock area, and these are some of our research vessels and things like that. So you can see that we're here on this nice wooded campus. Here we have more than 200 scientists and students that work throughout the year. We have a lot of internship programs available for undergrad students, and we also have a lot of volunteers, not only high school students, but adults as well. Um, one of the sorry, one of the labs that we have here, the one that I work in, is actually the Marine Invasions Research Lab, and this is one of the largest invasion research labs in the world. And the reason that we're so interested in marine invasions and biological invasions is because they're one of the major forces of ecological and evolutionary change in the world. They can change the structure and the function of ecosystems and also impact human society. And one of the ways that they impact human society is how they impact water quality and quantity. Here we have a picture of, there's this tunicate on this box down here. This is a fishery box. Each of these individual little things here are tunicates. They're a small invertebrate species that filters water. And this particular one is called Styloclava, and it's a very bad biofouling example. These things weigh these big boxes down, and the fishermen that use these can't actually haul them up because they're so heavy to get back up. So they end up staying in the ocean and become what we call ghost fishing. So they never actually pull them back up. They stay down there because they're just so ridden with this invasive species. So what are invasive species? It might be a term that you guys have heard before. One of the questions as we're going through this is, do you guys know what invasive species that you might have around you? I know that there are several throughout the United States and around the world, obviously. So this might be a catchphrase. People say invasive species, but what ones do you have around you? What we call invasive species are species that are introduced to a region beyond the range in which that they normally exist and ranges that they evolved to exist in, where they actually can create a self-sustaining population, and they can spread and cause ecological or economic harm.
And Amy, I'm curious if people we'd love to hear from you. Go ahead and use the Q&A box on the left side of the screen and share with us what invasive species are near you. I'm seeing a few answers coming in now.
Oh yeah, there you go. Snakeheads. Yeah, definitely. That's definitely a big issue in this area.
Beetles.
Oh yeah. Excellent. Honeysuckle. Yep. Definitely. Asian carp, right? Exactly. Oh yeah, we're actually going to talk about the water high, the flower here. Yeah, exactly. Kudzu. Oh yeah, we're definitely going to talk about zebra mussels. That'll be coming up. Excellent. Great job.
Jacqueline's asking, when we talk about invasive species, are we talking about things like bugs and weeds?
Yeah, I mean, definitely some bugs and weeds, but also not only terrestrial organisms, but marine organisms, which is what I focus on. So also things like fish, those tunicates that I showed you, snails, things like that. Oh, and we had another great example, starlings, birds, other types of birds that people introduced. One of the really interesting facts about invasive species is that when people moved from Europe to the United States, they wanted it to look like home. So they introduced all these birds and all these other organisms that were in Europe to the United States, and that's why we have, for example, starlings. That was a really good example. Yeah.
Excellent.
Exactly. Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about what Anna was talking about, that fish have been introduced deliberately. So this is a nice cartoon that shows what people think about when they think about invasive species. Someone mentioned zebra mussels, and there's also there's a plant called Milf Oil, and people think they attack them and cause all this economic harm and things. There's a lot of publicity around them. You can see here, this is a example of what they put up at the Great Lakes to notify people about zebra mussels and make sure that they clean their boats and things. Invasive species also have a lot of different names. People might know them as non-indigenous species, alien species, non-native species, or introduced species. So that's definitely something to keep your eye out for. And then again, this is another publicity thing about trying to remove all the plants that you can from boats and trailers and things. When you move your boat from lake to lake, you might actually be harboring invasive species in or around your boat. So this is something you should look out for if you go fishing or boating, things like that. So why do we study invasions? Who cares? Why should we as humans care about invasive species? I'd love to hear some of your thoughts as we talk about this. Why is this important? There are two major things that I like to think about. There's the biological side of it, but there's also, like we talked about before, the human dimensions of this. So please, I'm going to put up a couple of examples, but definitely let's hear some of your thoughts on this. So we study invasions because they impact basic community ecology and evolutionary biology. And we can answer questions like, why are some communities more vulnerable or resistant to invasive species? When an invasive species gets there, how does it adapt to its new environment? Or what kind of qualities make it be good in certain environments, I guess, do well? And then also, what are the effects on native species on humans? And then from the conservation and economic side, we're interested in what is the risk of harm of having a crab or a snail or a bird come into an environment? How does it impact the local community, not only humans, as we talked about, maybe even agriculture, some beetles and things like that? And going along with that, you have to understand the risks of intentional introductions. When you move fish around for aquaculture, you have to understand that. What about if you move mussels somewhere, or you move in like a pathogen to get rid of an animal that's there? What other things could the pathogen actually impact? You got to think about things like that. And then lastly, what can we do to protect native species? That's our ultimate goal, right? You don't want to move something somewhere and then completely change the ecosystem and have a completely different food web and all this kind of stuff. So these are the kinds of things as a scientist that we have to think about, and things that we're interested in looking into. So why do I study invasions? Because it is awesome. It is so fun being a scientist. I get to travel a lot of different places. I told you guys I grew up in Tennessee, but I've lived all over the United States and in Alaska, and I did my PhD in New Zealand, and I've been to Australia and Indonesia, and my field work is in Europe. So it's a lot of really cool traveling. I meet a lot of interesting people. This is in Poland. We were out catching crabs one day. This is up in Maine in the winter. We were doing some work on looking at the baitworm trade out of Maine as a source of introducing species. Then this is over in Finland. We were looking for mussels again. This is up in Maine. We're checking crab traps. This is out in New Zealand. You can see here there are there's these traps over here next to me. These are all experimental cages that we put out in the intertidal area where we're trying to check for snail growth and stuff like that. This is in Washington, D.C. when I got the job here at Smithsonian. I was very excited, as you can tell. I've also been to Antarctica. I did some work down there, and let me tell you, that was an experience. We were camping on the ice sheet for 6 weeks, and if something happened to you, we hoped you lived because you're in the middle of nowhere. And then finally, this is just some field work that we were doing around here, actually setting out a transect line. You can see this kind of rope next to me. This is a way of using density quadrats and things like that to figure out what animals are in a particular area along a metered transect line.
By the way, Amy, Anna is hoping that perhaps at some point you add a photo of the work that you will do in the future in Iraq, where she says they need people to be studying invasive species. She mentioned earlier that some of their native fish have been displaced by invasive fish.
Oh yeah, definitely. And that area is definitely in need of some really good scientific rigor. And hey, we should talk. Maybe we could put in some grant proposals or something. Maybe we could get together and do that. I've never been over there, so I would love to come over and work with you guys for sure. There's a lot of possibility. Yeah, definitely.
By the way, one other quick thought, maybe just to keep in the back of your mind, we don't need to answer it right now, but Jacqueline in Silver Spring is wondering whether there are any positive aspects regarding invasive species, and she's also wondering, is there sort of a best and worst list of invasive species?
Oh, wow. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we can answer that real quick. There definitely are positives regarding invasive species. Like, for instance, we were talking about aquaculture, where you bring fish to an area that might be low in source of protein. So it's a quick and easy way to get protein to lower economic areas. Also, things like wheat and grass, right? I mean, that normally isn't all around the world, but now it is, and we have that now, and now we have bread. So when you look at it in terms of an economic type of thing, it makes more sense when you look at the positives. As an ecologist, it's hard sometimes because when you move things around, there are negative impacts, whether or not you like it. They change, interactions in ecosystems. And the best and worst invasive species list, there's actually a list called the 100 Worst Invasive Species, and you can find it on the web, and it lists them all. So that's a great question, and there's definitely resources out there. There's several. I could name them off, but it would take too much time. So, and then the last question is just or the last picture is just at an island research station that I go to almost every summer up in Maine. It's called Shoals Marine Lab, and they have classes and things like that. Right. So, how do introduced species alter water quantity and quality? That's the focus of our talk, and I think do we have a poll here, Jonathan? Yeah.
Yes, in fact, we'd love for people to go ahead and take a moment and tell us in what ways would introduced or invasive species alter water quantity and quality. Go ahead and check off all the ones that you think apply here, and we'll show those results coming in real time.
No one's picking turn water to Jello?
Oh, somebody is giving that one a vote.
Oh, there you go.
So how are people doing?
This is good. What I'm seeing is that a lot of people don't necessarily realize that they can actually change the fire frequency. I'm seeing a lower number there. We'll talk about it in a minute, but having introduced species move into an area, especially with plants, what they do is a lot of times if you have a plant that's adapted to a drier climate, they have adaptations that allow them to suck up and kind of competitively get all the water. And so doing that, they kill native species, and then it's basically kindling for the forest fires. So they can actually change the fire frequency that way. But we'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, so this looks really good. So there are two ways. One way is directly, and there's a lot of different ways that introduced species can alter water quality and quantity directly, and you can see them listed there. We've talked about a little bit of those, and this is one example of those. This is an Asian clam that's been introduced into Lake Tahoe, and here we have a graph here. If you'd like to tell me your thoughts about this graph as I go through it, maybe in a couple sentences, what you think this graph is saying, while I kind of explain what Secchi depth is. What we have on the left-hand axis is depth of water in meters of the lake. And then on the right-hand axis, it's the depth of the water in feet, depending on what metric value you like to look at. And then on the x-axis down at the bottom, we have the years starting from 1965 to 2015. Now, Secchi depth. Secchi depth is a way that we look at water quality. And it's basically a dinner bowl-sized plate that is lowered down from the side of a boat, and it has black and white alternating colors to it. And you basically just lower it over the side of the boat, and there's markers on the line, the rope, and you see how long you can actually see the depth, and that tells you how clear the water is. Okay, so if we look here on, let's say, 1968, you can see that the Secchi depth, you could see down about 100 feet, right? And if you move closer over to nowadays, to the 2010 and things like that, you can see that the Secchi depth gets shallower and shallower and shallower, right? So you can see that there's something in the water that's affecting the clarity so that you can't see down into the water. And what it is this Asian clam. And what it's done is that it's a very efficient nutrient source. And so it actually filters things out of the water, but what it does is it concentrates it in its poop, and the poop actually increases phosphorus and nitrogen in the lake, and it causes algal blooms. And so you get all these algae that are on top of the water, and therefore you can't see into the water. So that's kind of an example of how this little baby clam, you can see how tiny these things are, can have a huge impact on an entire lake. So it only takes something so small that's successful to change water quality. So they can also indirectly affect water quality and quantity. So they can do things like change the water tables, the quantity and timing of runoff. We talked a little bit about fire frequency. They can change erosion patterns and sedimentation. And then there's several other different types that they can actually do, or things that they can do to alter the water body condition. Both of these in turn actually impact native organisms and plants. And that's what we're interested in as ecologists and biologists, is what they do to impact these organisms, how they do it. So introduced species are transported by many different pathways. We have natural ways like wind and currents, and there's that whole thing. I remember when I was a kid, you learn about bears that get seeds stuck to them, right? And then they move around. So things like that. But there's also non-natural ways, and a lot of these are actually enhanced or created by human activity. There's two different types. There's intentional, which is like deliberate action to relocate an organism. And maybe you guys can think of some ways intentionally that we as humans move organisms around, or examples of some of those. I'd love to see some of those in your in the question and answer box. Let's see some of those. And then there's also the unintentional, right? So you unknowingly relocate an organism. And let's hear some of those. If you have any examples of those, that would be great.
Great. So we're looking for those coming in, and I already see some people asking some very good questions that would make some good research questions, like how did the snakeheads get here? It was a question that we had someone from Las Vegas asking, if they're indigenous to China, how did they get here? Well, let's hypothesize. What are some possible ways? And we're also hearing about the Asian clam and how it might have gotten to Lake Tahoe. That's a question from Gail.
Can anything turn water Jello? That's a great question, Rochelle. To be honest, I can't think of anything except if you put Jello in the water. That's the only thing I can think of, but that's a great question. To answer Aaron's questions about how many clams, you know what? I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but there's some great research that's out there about this thing. You could probably look it up on the web. I'd be afraid to hazard a guess because it could be a couple thousand, but it's very well possible it could be up into the millions because they're just so little, and Lake Tahoe is so big. So
some of the responses coming in, Christopher said that unintentionally, invasive species might be transported on boat propellers.
Perfect. That's great. Yeah.
Devin wants to know, are barnacles an invasive species?
Yes, actually, there are several species that are invasive species that are barnacles. And what's interesting about this is an example of unintentional, where you've seen driftwood and you've seen pieces of drifting material. Barnacles attach to those driftwood pieces, or even the undersides of turtles and things like that, and they actually move around, right, via the currents naturally. And so they're actually moved around the world. One of the interesting things as an invasion ecologist is, you all remember the tsunami that happened in Japan recently? Well, what's happening is all of that material that got swept out to sea is actually arriving on the east coast or the west coast of North America. And so there's some of us that are actually going out there and seeing all the invasive species that are actually been attached to those things and are moving around. So that's a great example. Yeah. You can see here in the bottom, this graphic is actually showing you the different invasive marine species pathways and origins around the world. The colored circles that you can see around the world indicate the number of invasive marine species in different areas. And you can see, you know, in Europe we get a lot of species there because it's a hub, right, for commercial shipping. You get a lot of things that are moving around. You can also see on the east and west coasts of North America, there's also a lot of invasive species that we see, as well as in the Asian Pacific area, there's a lot. But one question I'd like to pose to you guys is, why do you think that these little circles are there? Is it because we just don't know what's out there? Do you think that there's just not enough research that's going on there? Or do you think that there just aren't many species there? The marine world is a huge world, so I'm surprised that there's not bigger circles there. So, right. So one of the major culprits that we see now is ballast water, and this is a lot of what we do in our lab. We have a whole section devoted to figuring out what is transported in ballast water throughout the world. So you can see here on the left-hand side, there's a kind of a cartoon about how ballast water works. Let's imagine that there's a ship in Japan and it needs to put on some cars. So there's a lot of cars on this big barge in Japan, and they're going to San Francisco. So they motor across the ocean laden with all of these cars. They get into San Francisco and they need to unload the cars. So they take them all off, and when they do that, the ship actually rises up in the water and they can't move very well through the water. So what they do is they suck in water from San Francisco Bay into the boat and actually sink the boat a little bit in the water so that it can move around. And so maybe it goes back to Japan, or maybe it goes to South America. And when it gets to those places, well, it needs to get the water out so that they can put cargo on it. So they release all of this water. And we're talking about hundreds of tons of water in each of these boats. And they can suck in fish. I've seen whole fish, you know, larger than my arm that have been sucked in. You get crabs, you get these things, because portholes, you know, you're used to maybe on a cruise ship that are the size of a dinner plate. These portholes on the side that suck in the water are bigger than me. So it's a large amount of large volume of water that's getting sucked in. And there's also things like larvae, baby things that are moved around that do very well. And you got to think that if everything's on the same latitude and it goes from San Francisco to Asia, these animals don't necessarily know they've been moved. And sometimes it's the same environment, and they do very well in these new places. Right. One of the things that we're doing in our lab is actually looking at ways to treat the ballast water when it comes here. One of the things we look at is mid-ocean exchanges, where the boats go out there, they have all this water, they let go some of the water, they suck in mid-ocean water, which usually has less species in it. It's easier to move around and better for the environment to move around. Other things we're looking at is actually trying to kill whatever's in it in the ballast water itself, either by filtering it out or using UV light or heat or something like that to do that. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to, as a lab, treat this, figure it out. So one of the examples we're going to talk about today is zebra mussels. Someone already mentioned that earlier. That's perfect. Zebra mussels are an iconic invasive species. A lot of people have heard of them. They are introduced into the Great Lakes via ballast water from Eurasia. We've got a poll here just about zebra mussels and what you guys know about it. So no one has them as a pet?
And we're about split between people who have heard of them and haven't, and
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually saw them for the first time a couple years ago in Vermont, and Lake Champlain, and they literally were just all over every surface that you could possibly see. So if you've been to the Great Lakes, you might have seen them and not even known what they were, because they're everywhere there. So this is kind of a picture down here, just looking at the locations where they're found in the United States. You can see the congregation around the Great Lakes area. As mussels, what they do to feed is they filter phytoplankton and zooplankton. Do people know? People know what phyto and zooplankton are, and how they work with mollusks.
And you can just give us a yes in the chat or no if you want a little bit more about it.
Well, I'll just tell you. That's fine.
Go for it.
Phytoplankton is plant material like algae and things like that. And zooplankton, a lot of it's actually larvae and very small animals that are in the water. And so what we have here is these zebra mussels. They have an excurrent and an in-current and an excurrent siphon. So what happens is the water comes in through here, and I have a schematic on the next page, and they push it out through there. But a single mussel can filter up to 2 liters of water a day. That's a lot. That's a lot of water going through this tiny little animal here. And doing this, they actually remove nutrients and food for organisms, native organisms, and it also increases the water clarity because they're getting everything out of the water. It makes the water clearer. You can see down deeper. And so this is some pictures of how zebra mussels just cover any surface they possibly can. You can see down here there's a crayfish that's actually covered with zebra mussels. Here these are aquaculture intake pipes, and you can just see there's no way there's going to get a lot of water through there. And then this is a lawn chair that someone has dumped into the lake that's been completely covered in these mussels. So once they're there, they're very productive, they do very well, and they spread very quickly. So this is a very successful invasive species. So this is just an example of how these mussels work. So we have this this in-current siphon that you get here, and it sucks in the water along here, and this is the gills, and the gills filter out all of these different particles like zooplankton and sediment and algae, so that's the phytoplankton, and also contaminants, so they can actually filter out pollutants as well. And then once it goes through the gill, it goes out this excurrent siphon as filtered seawater. So this is clean water that's actually getting through these mussels. And so what they do is they can filter out these pollutants and things, and they concentrate these in their feces and then put them into the sediment, and actually can either enrich the sediment or actually make the sediment even more polluted than it was originally. This photo is an aerial photograph of the Great Lakes, and so here you're seeing it from above as if you were in a plane. So this is one of the lakes. To be honest, I can't remember which one. But this is an incidence. You see this green stuff here. This is an algal bloom that's been caused by the zebra mussels because they change all the nutrient dynamics in the system. And the Great Lakes are known for their turnover activities in the winter, where you get a lot of water or a lot of wind that moves the water. And so water needs to come up where that wind has moved the water. And because you get that, you get the sediment moving around. It allows all of those nutrients to come up into the system, and it creates these algal blooms. So they can actually change water clarity and alter conditions for native species.
I think you're answering Jacqueline's question when you were talking about that they can concentrate those nutrients, and that can Jacqueline was saying it seems like zebra mussels are natural plumbers. They sound like they might be beneficial. What is the impact of the algal blooms that they're causing, and how is that a bad thing?
Right. Okay. So the algal blooms actually, the reason that you see these algal blooms is because they're so dense. And the problem with that is that there's just so much there that they suck up all the available oxygen in the system. So when you get algal blooms like this, you actually get a lot of fish kills because the fish need a lot of oxygen to survive. The oxygen is taken up by the algae, and so they float to the surface dead. And so you might hear of fish kills in the Great Lakes, and some of that is actually caused by this. So this is an example of that. The other thing is that a lot of these algae produce toxins, and we'll talk about this in a second too. Sorry. So they produce toxins, and so other filter-feeding organisms, other native mussels, or other organisms in the system suck in the algae with their toxins, and they kill them. So that's another example of, thank you, another example of maybe how they are disruptive to the ecosystem. I hope that answers your question.
Great. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah, no worries. That's an interesting question. Aaron asked if you have a 2-liter bucket and you put a zebra mussel in it, would it suck it in and spit it out? Well, you wouldn't be able to tell. It's not like it sucks in all 2 liters and goes through it and then pushes it back out. That would be so cool if that happened, though. But they actually filter it over a slow amount of time. So over the whole course of the day, they can filter 2 liters of water. So at any one time, they only probably have, maybe a cup full or something that's going through them. So you probably wouldn't be able to see it all in one go. Yeah. Okay. So another example is this common carp species here. This is a fish that was actually intentionally introduced. We talked about aquaculture earlier. So this was introduced into the Great Lakes in the 1800s by the government as a source of cheap food for the future. And what's happened is that these fish are very hardy, and they can actually escape into other ecosystems during flooding events and can actually now be found in every state throughout the United States. And so we get a lot of those around the area. You may have seen these if you're a fisherman or your father's a fisherman. People I know have maybe eaten them as well. Maybe even kept them as pets, possibly. Could possibly happen.
About 75% of our friends logged in today have either seen a carp, caught one, or eaten one.
Yeah, perfect.
Most have encountered one somehow.
Great. But what this particular fish does is that when it feeds, it's similar to maybe what you've heard of from hogs or things like that, that they root around and they move up the sediment and they're looking for roots and plants and things like that. So the carp actually does that. It uses its mouth parts and actually kick up the sediment. And by doing that, you can see in this this top right-hand corner, you can see all the sediment that this fish is kicked up. And when they do that, they change the turbidity or the quality or clarity of the water, and it actually can impact other species. When they do this also, we kind of talked about how some lakes and rivers have nutrients in their sediments. They actually release all this phosphorus and nitrogen that's been in the sediment, and that can actually increase the algal abundance, similar to what we talked about with the zebra mussels. This is a large graph that kind of shows you how turbidity, so how mucky the water is, actually impacts freshwater fish. So this is relational trends of freshwater fish activity to turbidity values in time. So we can see here on the bottom that over time, from hours to months, turbidity levels can go from 0 to very, very high. And at the beginning, over a short period of time, when there's low turbidity, so there's a little bit of mud in the water, they show signs of stress. And then if that turbidity increases, the fish abandon cover and actually can make them more prone to predation. And then over time, they can actually change their behavior, their physiology, their feeding, and it can actually increase coughing rates, which actually affect how they breathe, right? And so if you increase turbidity even more, all of these things combined actually can decrease the growth rates. And then that increases hatching rates of the eggs. And then all of this over time can actually cause a long-term reduction in feeding success, which all of these can ultimately lead to death over time. So you can see how something so small as turbidity can have such a major impact on these species, all caused by this other fish.
And Amy, if we were to imagine somebody coming along into our home or our neighborhood and shaking up the dirt, basically, at the in the street or the gravel or the mud,
right, yeah.
We wouldn't be able to do our normal functions. Not
That's
only would
perfect.
it be unpleasant, but we wouldn't be thinking about things like
right.
Like breeding and finding
Eating.
cover. We would be constantly on a search for a clean place.
Exactly, exactly. It's similar to maybe what our friend in Iraq sees with maybe the sandstorms that come through. What we saw in Antarctica when you get the snowstorms that come through. you're not really paying attention much to feeding or anything else at that time. You're just trying to get out of there and be able to see. So that's kind of an example of that.
Erin wants to know, does the carp kick out other fish like starlings do to other birds?
Huh, that is a really good question. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to look it up and get back to you. I would assume that they do have an impact, but I don't know how much of it is a, hey, get out of here, this is my territory impact, more than a, I'm going to change the habitat or the ecosystem, and then those fish move of their own accord. So I'm not sure the answer to that. So the next example we have is this chub. It's another fish species. It was introduced into the Oregon lakes in the 50s. And these guys eat zooplankton. And the zooplankton normally eat phytoplankton. We talked about this a little bit before. So when they do this, they decrease the zooplankton, which allows for this uncontrolled growth of the algae, the phytoplankton. We talked a little bit before, right, about how the algae can release the toxins into the water. Well, these toxins are not only toxic to other animals, they're toxic to us as well. And so this affects water quality and overall recreation use in the lakes, and actually causes serious public health concerns as well. If you ingest the water, if you ingest organisms that have breathed the water, things like that. And so this is kind of an example of, once an invasive species is there, it's very hard to get rid of it. They've been trying to get rid of this for years, similar to zebra mussels, similar to the Asian carp. Once it's there, like I said, it's very hard to get rid of it. So that's definitely something to think about, and why we shouldn't have these species here. We should do preventative efforts, not once they get there trying to get rid of them. Another example, we're turning to plants now here, is invasive riparian species. I'm going to throw it out there. I'm going to talk about it, but what is a riparian species? Does anyone know what that term means? Maybe you can use it by, or figure it out by context clues. But invasive riparian species can actually consume 10 to 20 times the water used by native species. We kind of talked about this a little bit before. I introduced it a little bit. By doing this, they lower the water available to other plants, and they increase patches of dry streams. And the reason they're able to do this is they're actually adapted to much drier climates. And so they have adapted abilities to make them very competitive for water. And so they do very well in these areas.
Erin says riparian are shoreline.
Exactly. Perfect. Good job, Erin. That's perfect. Yeah. So riparian species are shoreline species. They're around lakes and rivers, things like that. So these species also dominate those limited sources of moisture, and they can increase the frequency, intensity, and effect of fires and floods. And we talked a little bit about this, right? They kill the native species, the native species then becomes kindling, and then actually increases the fire frequency. Another example is cheatgrass, and many people might know what this is, but they didn't realize they knew what it was. So this species is actually in the western U.S., and it covers a lot of expanse in the western U.S. Yep, we get some people. Okay. Okay. So some people definitely have seen it, and others haven't. So again, this species actually does very well, and it increases the occurrence of fires and increases fire-related impacts on water bodies. This particular species is a little different because it's actually very flammable. So this is how it actually increases the occurrence of fires. And this picture over here actually shows you kind of a timeline. So here we see in the top, this is an area that has no cheatgrass, so this would be kind of native, original state. And then in the next one, we see cheatgrass here, all of this stuff here, which is lacking up here, you can see. So all this nice brown stuff. And then here, what do we see? We see the brown stuff that's still here, and all of these nice, beautiful green shrubs are now dead. And so this is an example of this kindling that's there, that's in there for that increases the fire frequency. They can also reduce the runoff and actually can change the nutrient input into the ecosystem. Jawwood asked us if there was a different species than the tui chub. To be honest, I'm not sure about that. We'd have to look that up and make sure that's the same species. I don't know off the top of my head. So this is an example of one of the species that you guys might all be familiar with, at least on the east coast of the United States. There's this little insect that you can see here. It's a little guy here that actually was introduced in the eastern U.S. in the 1940s. And what's interesting about this species is that it actually causes hemlock death. And so this is what we've been seeing with all the eastern hemlocks that you guys might be familiar with that are dying on the east coast of North America. And it causes hemlock death by feeding on the stored starches in the tree, which are actually critical to the tree's survival and growth. And if they don't have those starches, then they die. This single insect can cause tree death within 4 to 10 years. And over here on the picture you see in the lower right-hand corner, all of these white things that you see are actually the insect eggs. So you can see how many are all over this poor tree. And so when when they actually hatch, then they just go right into feeding on that tree and will ultimately cause the tree to die. Here's a graphical representation of the extent of this devastation. So we can see here the green and the red part here is actually the range of the hemlock tree. All of the red area here is where the hemlocks have died because of this insect infestation. So you can see almost half of the range is actually impacted by this insect. And when it does that, these trees are very large. They provide forest cover for animals. They provide ecosystem services to the rivers and the streams and prevent erosion and sedimentation input into the rivers and streams. When you take all those out, you impact that area. Another example are the aquatic plants, and they can either be macroscopic or microscopic. So macroscopic are large plants, things that you're familiar with, these water lilies. And then, yeah, we have a poll of which of the following are plants of examples of macroscopic plants. So we have fanwort or milf oil, bladderwort, lily pad, or hogwarts. So no one's picking hogwarts. That's good. Good job, everyone. And we've got kind of a spread of other examples. Actually, all of the top 4 are macroscopic invasive aquatic plant species. So good job. We also have microscopic examples. So we've already touched on this, the algal blooms. So these plants can not only interfere with drinking water, but they can also impact ecological functioning. And we talked a little bit about that before, but we'll go into some examples now. One of the examples we talked about were these algae blooms. And so most of these blooms are actually harmless, but sometimes they can create these toxins which are potentially harmful. We call these things harmful algal blooms. And they can alter food web dynamics and produce these toxins. So blooms can actually be green or brown or reddish orange depending on the algal species, the aquatic ecosystem, and the concentrations of the organisms themselves. If you see the middle picture, there's this brown algae that's running along here, but the white little thing there, that's actually a boat. So you can see the extent and the magnitude of these algal blooms. It's not something very small, it's something very big. Because of that, they have a huge impact. As scientists, we like to call them harmful algal blooms, but you may have heard of them as red tides. And this is a misnomer because they're not all red tides, as you can see. You can see they're green tides, or they can be this brown tide. So what we like to call them is harmful algal blooms. Another example is this water chestnut. And this might be something that a lot of people see as well, that's floating in lakes and rivers and streams in the northeast of America and also over in California. The reason this species, it was actually introduced, and the reason is because you see these things at the top. These are actually water chestnuts, similar to artichoke hearts, and people eat them. So you can actually dish them up. And I haven't had one. I don't know if anyone else has. They look tasty. I don't know. So that might be something maybe you guys should try. So you can see here in the bottom corner, these get very dense. They create these very large mats in an area, and in these small or these shallow, calm, and nutrient-rich waters. And so they can actually extend their stems up to 16 feet where they're rooted in the bottom of the lake or the river. So they're very large plants. This is an example of what they're doing to get rid of them. This is a huge machine that actually goes down into the lake, and they suck up this chestnut onto this kind of conveyor belt here. And there's a kind of like a, like a tree grinder, I guess, in the back of it. And so it grinds it all up and takes it away. So that's kind of what people are trying to do to get rid of it. And water chestnut can completely change ecosystems. So up here in the top of this picture, you can see a regular ecosystem. There's birds and plants, and you can see the water's clear, the fish are swimming, looks really nice. You want to get into there. But after water chestnut, they can change the ecosystem so much that you get these algae blooms, you get the dead fish, you get one bird that doesn't have anything to eat there. And the ways that it does this is it's a fierce competitor. So it actually gets rid of other native species. It can create these mats, which are a hazard to boaters, but these mats also do not allow native plants to get the sunlight that they need. And because of that, it degrades the natural functioning of the ecosystem itself. Also, they cause drops in oxygen because of the shading, and this can actually impact fish, it kills fish. And then they trap organic matter and create silt, which increases sediment levels and actually can create breeding spots for mosquitoes. So it can completely change a whole ecosystem. One of the last examples is this Milf Oil. It's around North America, and it also clogs waterways. You can see here in the bottom picture, it's actually impacted this boat. Like the other plant, it decreases water flow, oxygen levels, and can kill underwater plants and animals. And the mats actually do the same thing as the one before. They eliminate the native plants and actually impact animal communities because they can't then get to water, and then they can't get their nesting sites or their shelter sites and things like that. The decomposition of this plant can alter the nutrient cycles and the oxygen levels. And then this also reduces algal blooms. So you're seeing a trend here, how these plants can alter complete ecosystems and do complete damage in such a short amount of time. So I kind of turn this and leave this with you guys. I've shown you some examples of these invasive species, maybe in your backyards, maybe things that you have seen, didn't know you had seen. But we put this out to the public because everyone can make a difference when it comes to invasive species. What is something that you can do to do that? And one of the things you can see here is clean your boat. Not only may you have zebra mussels when you move from lake to lake, but you also might have algae or plants attached to your boat propeller. Someone said that before. That's an excellent example. I also saw someone said that you can actually trap plants and seeds when you walk around. So you got to clean when you move from state to state. I always do this. I look like a complete nerd, but I take an old toothbrush and brush my shoes and things like that when you move around because you don't know what you're actually moving. So I leave that to you guys. Is what can you do to help prevent the spread of invasive species?
Well, you've certainly impressed on people how small creatures can have a big impact.
Right.
It might make us think about our own actions and what kind of impact we can have and in changing the environment around us, sometimes not for the good.
Right.
So we'd love to hear from you as you reflect on what you just learned today. What kinds of things might you do? What kinds of things can you do to either be aware of or to help curtail the harmful impacts of invasive species? By the way, I have a couple. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Amy. I have a
course.
couple of little lightning round of maybe we'll do
let's do
30
it.
seconds and take a couple of quick questions.
Okay.
So here's one. The cheatgrass. Any idea where it came from originally?
I think we had that in the slide actually. I think it's from Eurasia, but I'm not sh I think so, right? Everyone's nodding, so yes,
Okay,
I think that's
good.
right.
Good. Thank you, Erin. And thank you, Amy. Do we know if any fish feed off of the water chestnuts?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I would suspect that fish may do, but not just really off of it in terms of pulling out leaves, but I'm sure insects actually colonize those that habitat, and so maybe they feed off the insects that use it. That would be my guess, is habitat.
Great. And two more quick ones. This
Yeah.
one from Heather in Virginia. We noticed that you say the words algae and algal differently than we do. We say them with a J sound. Is one pronunciation more correct?
To be honest, it comes from I did my PhD in New Zealand, and the pronunciation is sometimes really different, and I get called on that all the time. I'm so sorry. It's the same word. It's just that I sound weird and funny saying it. So sorry about that. Yeah.
So it's perhaps regional, so
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
all right. And thank you. By the way, I had just a couple of quick logistical notes I wanted to go over with people and some fun things to mention. First of all, if this is we have 4 sessions today. This is the first of 4. But if this is the last of the 4 sessions that you'll be attending because of your schedule and you intend to perhaps come back in the future and look at the recordings, we'd love for you to give us some feedback. There's an evaluation link. If you are coming to subsequent sessions today, no need to fill it out. It's an overall evaluation of the day's activities, so just fill it out at the end of the last session that you'll be attending today. That's number 1. Number 2, we have several more sessions today and tomorrow, but it's not the end of Shout, even though this is the 3rd Shout conference series of the year. So we want you to stay connected. One great way to do that is to follow us on Twitter. You can look for us. Of course, you can find the links to all of our social media at shoutlearning.org. So check that out. Also, remember, we are on Facebook as well. You can find us at facebook.com/shoutlearning. You'll see ongoing resources, ideas, and of course upcoming programs, as well as links to past treasures of resources that you might have missed. And most recently, you can also follow us on Pinterest, where you can find a Shout Learning curated collection of images and resources that accompany all of the great topics we're exploring together. So we hope you will stay connected, and we hope you will stay online, literally right now, because in about 2 to 3 minutes, we'll be back to kick off our next session, which it will ask the question, does the health of water depend on the health of land? And I think some of the things you're going to learn about the role that the land plays in the health of the water will surprise you. Our host for that session will be Jess Parker, who is a senior scientist here at CERC. So stay where you are. We'll be back in about 2 minutes. And please join me in thanking Amy Fowler for a fantastic kickoff to the day. Thank you, Amy.